very lively conversation. I can see it going on right now, so please take your seats so we can begin again, resume our deliberations. It's a great honor for me personally and for us to have as our keynote presenter tonight former Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman. Congressman Holtzman is currently co-chair of government relations with the law firm Herrick Feinstein. She was the youngest woman ever elected to U.S. Congress and served for 8 years in the House of Representatives. In 1973, she joined with 4 Air Force officers, including 3 B-52 pilots, in a federal lawsuit seeking an injunction against U.S. bombing of Cambodia. She is perhaps best well known during her congressional career as a member of the House Judiciary Committee and gained national attention for her constructive role during the committee's Watergate hearings. Also, while she was in the House, Congresswoman Holtzman was a leader in issues of immigration, refugees, and international law. She worked on the deportation of Nazi war criminals and was a leader in efforts to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment and to extend rights for women generally. Later in her career, she was elected as the district attorney for Kings County, Brooklyn, and becoming the first woman DA in New York City. Later, she was the comptroller of New York City. She's been a leader for human rights and justice and peace throughout her career. So please join me in welcoming Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this on? Can you hear me? The mic's on? Okay. Thank you very much for your kind words, and I'm really honored to be at this conference. I'm really honored to be asked to be keynote speaker. I have to say that, I don't know if you're aware, but former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel was supposed to have this honor, and for whatever reason, he was unable to fulfill that task. I kept saying to myself, now why was I selected for this? After all, what do I have to do with Chuck Hagel? But it turns out, as I remembered, that actually Mother Jones magazine had a dream cabinet. I think it must have been in the early 1980s, and I was their Secretary of Defense. So that's probably why I'm here. I also want to acknowledge and thank and recognize those people in this audience who have strongly opposed the war in Vietnam, stood up against the injustice and the impropriety of the war. Dissent was very hard, let's not forget that, and all of us are indebted to them for their courage and actually for strengthening our democracy. After 50 years, when the war intensified in a major way, and after 40 years, which is when the war ended, it's an important time to take stock, to examine the issues, and think about where this places us for the future. I'd like to start by saying some things that reflect my own opinion, and very deeply held. I believe the war was wrong, the war in Vietnam, and it was tragically wrong. The U.S. had no business being there, and no business fighting. Vietnam was a small country, and it posed no threat whatsoever to the United States of America. The human cost of that war can never be overstated, and possibly we don't even know the full dimensions of it. We know that more than 58,000 Americans lost their lives, more than 300,000 Americans were wounded, hundreds of thousands of other Americans were damaged psychologically or through exposure to chemicals used by the United States. The number of Vietnamese who were killed as a result of our actions, the number of Laotians, the number of Cambodians, I don't believe that number has been fully counted. The estimates are in the millions. The economic cost of the war is stated to be about $750 billion. That's just for the U.S. The environmental cost to Vietnam, not to mention Laos and Cambodia, is incalculable. And by the way, this was the first major U.S. defeat since World War II, if we don't count Korea, where we ended up where we started. Now, I don't know all the reasons for the war. I just like to point to a few because these are reasons that still persist today. Theoretically, the war was to stop monolithic communism from spreading. And something called the domino theory was invoked. In other words, if Vietnam fell, other non-communist countries around Vietnam would be communist, and if they became communist, that red ink would spread over the entire globe of the world. Well, first of all, the domino theory was nonsense when it was articulated, and it turned out to be nonsense. In fact, no other countries fell to communist rule just because Vietnam fell. Our theory about why we were going into the war reflected a disastrous lack of understanding about the anti-colonial attitudes of the Vietnamese people. They had fought the French for decades, and then the Japanese. They wanted self-rule. By the way, FDR opposed supporting French imperialist aims. The failure to understand that communism wasn't monolithic was also an extraordinary part of the ignorance that motivated the actions of the United States. The idea that China and Vietnam were like this was ridiculous. Anybody who knew anything about history, which of course excludes top people in the US government, at least at that time, China and Vietnam had fought many wars over the centuries, and indeed, just a few years after the Vietnam War ended, China and Vietnam fought another war. I actually was there at the time. It was a brief war that Vietnam won. I want to say something about the irony of this. The United States was so worried about China and China in our desire to fight Vietnam. It's important to remember that after President Nixon went to China in 1972, all of a sudden, whatever China wanted, China got, because we were now playing a different global politics. We were playing China off against Russia. So let's remember, when Pol Pot was to be seated in the UN, China wanted us to vote for the seating of that genocidal dictator. And guess what? The United States voted for that. A shocking and shameful thing. So that was our fear about China. We were worried about China. In the end, we were their yo-yo at the end of a string. Okay, just an irony that's worth pointing out. It was also an arrogant belief, not only ignorance, but arrogance motivated our actions. It was an arrogant belief that the United States could not lose. The French lost, but that's France. It had nothing to do with us. We were and are invincible. We also had the arrogance to believe that we had the right to impose our system on others, even at the cost of their lives. Some of you may remember a famous statement that was made by a US official who said, "We may have to destroy a village to save it." Politically, there were other factors that were involved too, not just arrogance and not just ignorance of history, but also there were deep politics involved. After the communist takeover of China, many Democrats were accused of losing China. And that was a political concern for two presidents, namely John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. No one wanted to be in that hot seat again. And so crass political concerns affected the decision to continue. And some people may think that there was an idealism that motivated our actions, that we were opposing communist dictatorship. Let's even assume that that was the case. But we had nothing to replace it with. The means that we used to achieve this end were horrific. The war was not necessary, nor were the Vietnamese people asking for our intervention. The South Vietnamese government was corrupt and brutal. That's what we offered as an alternative. I want to say, not only do we have to look at the factors that involved our getting into this war, but I think it's critical not to forget that the conduct of the war by the United States was brutal and may well have involved the commission of war crimes. Let's start with chemical warfare. The United States dropped 20 million gallons of Agent Orange, covering some 25 million acres in Vietnam alone. I'm not including Laos, maybe even Cambodia. Agent Orange contains dioxin, and it's one of the most deadly chemicals known to humans. The purpose of the chemical use of Agent Orange was to defoliate trees so that the guerrillas could be seen beneath the trees. Of course, when you defoliate trees and you destroy trees, you destroy the whole ecosystem of the forest. You destroy the animals, the birds, the insects, whatever keeps life going. The purpose of the use of Agent Orange, chemical warfare, was to destroy food crops. We wanted to destroy food crops. You might say, what's this about? We're trying to win, as the saying goes, hearts and minds. Why would we want to starve Vietnamese people? That's a question I'm not prepared to answer, but it does raise some very serious questions about the counterproductiveness of the methods we used. Part of the other reason that we used defoliation and Agent Orange was to drive peasants out of the countryside into the city so that the Viet Cong wouldn't be able to win their hearts and minds or their affections. So in order to accomplish these goals, the defoliants we use, Agent Orange. The estimates are that about 500,000 Vietnamese children were born with birth defects. U.S. soldiers were also injured by Agent Orange and other defoliants. It took many, many years for the United States government to accept responsibility for the damage that this caused to our own soldiers. We also dropped, as I mentioned, other defoliants and used napalm. The damage to humans, to the environment, to animals, to birds, to insects, to plants was enormous and remains enormous. Although a federal judge ruled that U.S. use of Agent Orange was not a war crime under the protocol, one of the protocols to the Geneva Conventions, I find myself very troubled by that ruling. Massive uses of chemicals to destroy the environment of a country's population should fall within the purview of a ban on chemical warfare. And that's the only ruling, but in my view, that shouldn't be the case. In addition to the use of defoliants and the destruction of the environment and the chemical warfare that was waged by the United States, we also engaged in a program of assassinations. It was called Operation Phoenix. We decided we could recognize Viet Cong and just kill them. Well, of course, how do you tell a person who's a Viet Cong? They weren't wearing exactly a badge. It's kind of like the kinds that we got walking into this conference. So obviously there were many mistakes and there was no due process, and that was one of the programs. In addition, we had the program of strategic hamlets. Again, to keep the Viet Cong from meeting with, trying to work with, trying to persuade the Vietnamese peasants. We uprooted peasants from their own land, put them in stockades, took them away from their habitats, from their environment, from their background, from where they grew up, from their livelihood. That was another program. And I don't want to continue without mentioning the fact of massacres that took place. We all know the infamous situation with regard to My Lai, where some say as many as 500, mostly women and children, were massacred by U.S. troops. Lieutenant Calley, one of the officers there, the only one held accountable, served 3 years in prison for that. How many other massacres were undertaken? It's not fully been documented. Recently, an investigative journalist discovered archives, military archives, that did show an examination of some massacres and an investigation which tended to show that those massacres took place, but there were no prosecutions and no one was held accountable for that, and there's been no overall study of this problem. But My Lai was not the only one. Again, this was a program we were trying to win hearts and minds. It's hard to understand how massacres fits into that. We used cluster bombs. We all know about the danger that cluster bombs has for children. And then, of course, we were engaged in massive bombing. That involved striking civilian targets. Thousands of hospital beds, for example, were destroyed in the north. One famous facility for treating leprosy was bombed 39 times. More bombs were dropped in Vietnam than in Europe during World War II. The bombing of civilian targets, as we know, is a war crime. And the remains of the bombing, the ordnance, not to mention landmines, continues to be a problem in Vietnam. The United States has taken no real responsibility for the damage it's caused, particularly through the assault with chemical weapons on the territory of Vietnam, and for the destruction of the infrastructure in the north, particularly hospitals and dikes. And there hasn't been any apology either. I should say also, in connection with the 1973 Paris Peace Accords, President Nixon wrote a secret letter which became public several years later, in which he indicated that there would be approximately $3 billion in funds for rebuilding the infrastructure of Vietnam. That promise was never kept. Recently, in the last few years, small amounts of money have been pledged to help clean up areas in and around U.S. Army bases or Air Force bases where Agent Orange was stored. That, of course, addresses only a small part of the problem, but it's a small beginning. It should have been done a long time ago, and it hasn't been. That job still remains to be completed. What I'm talking to you about is what happened, what I've been talking to you about is what happened in Vietnam. I want to talk to you a little bit about what the implications were of that war for our democracy here at home. Let's start out by recognizing that the presidential lying that got us into the war and that continued the war subverted our Constitution and subverted our democracy. President Johnson falsely claimed that there was an attack on a naval vessel in connection with the Gulf of Tonkin that produced a congressional response of only 2 members of the House and Senate of the Senate opposed it. Out of 535 people, 533 supported giving President Johnson carte blanche to use whatever military force was necessary. Of course, as we later turned out, there was no such firing on a U.S. Vessel, and that was a pretext and a ruse to give the President Johnson, the war-making powers that he wanted. But Johnson wasn't alone in doing this. President Nixon decided to bomb Cambodia right shortly after he took office in a huge use of bombers and bombs to relentlessly bomb Cambodia. That bombing of a neutral country was without notice to Congress, without support from Congress, and indeed, like any crook, 2 sets of books were kept by President Nixon. One set of books showing where we actually bombed, including Cambodia, and then there was a separate set of books that showed where, for the public, that showed that all of this bombing took place in Vietnam. Why is this a problem? Because our democracy depends on a system of checks and balances. President and Congress and the courts are to balance each other out. Why do we have that system? Because the framers of the Constitution were deeply troubled about the idea that anybody would amass too much power, and they were particularly concerned about presidents amassing power in connection with war because they were students of history and they understood that monarchs have a characteristic which is to take countries into war, bleeding them economically and destroying their young people. For that reason, the Constitution makes it very clear, in my opinion, that the President and the Congress must act together for war-making power to be undertaken. And by the way, there's also the theory, not a bad theory, that two heads are better than one. That's also part of this. Well, if you lie to Congress, or if you conceal from Congress, Congress cannot play its constitutional role, cannot be a check on presidential war-making activities. And so what you had here with regard to Johnson and Nixon was a subversion of the Constitution and a direct assault on our democratic and constitutional system. There was other presidential misconduct connected to the Vietnam War. It now seems likely, we didn't know it at the time, or even shortly thereafter, that when Richard Nixon was a candidate for the presidency for the first time in 1968, that he worked to thwart the peace talks that were then ongoing in order to prevent his opponent, Hubert Humphrey, from winning the election. If peace had been declared under Johnson, it's quite likely that Humphrey could have won the election. But the new evidence suggests that Nixon's forces, campaign forces, were in touch with the South Vietnamese government and persuaded them to oppose the proposed peace plan. And therefore he was elected, and of course he had a secret plan for peace. We never knew what it was. To his dying day, we never knew what it was. But he was elected based on that plan. The other misconduct that took place in connection with the Vietnam War is Watergate. People don't associate Watergate with the Vietnam War, but I'm going to tell you how it happened. There is a direct line from the Vietnam War to Watergate. Very shortly after President Nixon took office in 1969, as I had mentioned before, he began the secret bombing of Cambodia. This was to be a secret from Congress and from the American people. Obviously, it wasn't a secret from the Cambodians. They were being bombed. Okay. Some enterprising New York Times reporter found out about this and wrote a front-page story in the New York Times. Nixon decided he had to find out who was leaking this to the New York Times reporter, and he set up a secret and illegal wiretapping system to find out this leak. Since it was so handy-dandy to be able to wiretap reporters, he expanded it and began to wiretap his own White House staff. And that, when his White House staffers went to work for his political opponent, Senator Muskie, he was able to get wiretaps of Senator Muskie. In any case, this was illegal wiretapping, and by the way, it was part of the grounds of the impeachment of Richard Nixon that was voted by the House Judiciary Committee in 1974. The wiretapping, the illegal wiretapping, was then placed, and break-ins, that little program was then placed in the hands of a new unit set up inside the White House called the Plumbers Unit. The plumbers were out, started to fix leaks to the press, but then they had wider horizons. They had their own imperialism. So what happened was that they were involved, among other things, in the break-in in Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, a crime, and the plumbers were also involved in the Watergate break-in itself. Direct line. Bombing of Cambodia, violation of the Constitution, into an illegal and unconstitutional system for break-ins and illegal wiretaps that was run right out of the White House itself. Okay, one other aspect of presidential misconduct has to do with President Nixon's enemies list, which he created because he was angry about the protests. And so he said, I'm going to get those people who are protesting the war, and he called for the creation of a list of major protesters, and he wanted the IRS to conduct harassing audits of them. By the way, that was also one of the grounds that the House Judiciary Committee voted for his impeachment on. The Vietnam War, figured deeply in presidential misconduct. Let's look at the other institutions of our government. Congress. Congress was supine at the get-go. As I said to you, only 2 members of the House and Senate voted against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. But as the war kept going and as there became more public reaction against the war, Congress found its voice and found its sense of purpose, found its constitutional bearings, and finally in June 1973, someone asked earlier, when was military aid, when did Congress order an end to the bombing and to military activities in Vietnam and Indochina? That vote took place in June 1973. Congress voted an end to all war making in and around Indochina and refused to provide any additional funds for war making further. And what about the courts? So we finally have Congress waking up to deal with this problem, and then we have the courts. The courts were loath to get involved in dealing with the Vietnam War. They relied on something called political question doctrine, which means if it's a political question, the courts can't get involved because we know the courts are not political. But I want to talk to you about my case because it's a really interesting case. As was mentioned, I joined with 4 Air Force pilots. In fact, I got a phone call from the ACLU late one night. I was sitting in my congressional office, and since I had run for Congress against the Vietnam War and defeated a major proponent of the war, I was eager to do everything I could to stop the war. And so the ACLU called me late at night and they said, Liz, we'd like you to be a plaintiff in this lawsuit. And I said, great. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is because of some great quality of my own that I've been selected to be one of the plaintiffs in this lawsuit. And I said, well, why me? And they said, well, we need to bring this case in Brooklyn. So it had nothing to do with me. It had to do with where I lived because they wanted to get it in front of this particular judge in Brooklyn. And we did get it in front of the particular judge, and he was actually a Republican appointee. And he had previously ruled in a case on the Vietnam War saying Congress had continued to provide funds and voted for funds for the Vietnam War, so you couldn't say Congress was not complicit in supporting the Vietnam War. Congress had plenty of opportunity to say no. The reason the ACLU wanted to get before him was because Congress did not want to support a war in Cambodia, a bombing of Cambodia, an incursion of Cambodia. And so it was a different factual situation. And they thought, well, maybe the judge would see the difference, having ruled that Congress was complicit in one case, could see that Congress wasn't complicit here and would rule in our favor. And lo and behold, the judge ruled that the bombing of Cambodia was unconstitutional and issued an injunction against the Pentagon. And the name of the case was Holtzman against Schlesinger, and Schlesinger was then the Secretary of Defense. And it was an injunction against the Secretary of Defense to stop the bombing. This was a first, and I think it's probably an only in U.S. history. It was the first time that any court had ever interfered with war-making activities. Well, as you can imagine, the government was quite upset about this, and they immediately appealed to the appellate court. I'm going through this because this is really important in terms of understanding how our institutions of government work when it came to the Vietnam War. The appellate court by 2-to-1 margin, found every reason to overturn the judge's decision. I had no standing as a member of Congress. The pilots had no standing, even though they could be shot down as they were flying from Guam to Cambodia. Political question, you name it. I think there must have been 15 reasons that they said no. At that point, under practice, federal procedures, you could go to the Supreme Court. And you have to go to the Supreme Court justice for your area. Every Supreme Court justice is given a region that they're an appellate judge for. And we went to Thurgood Marshall, who was the judge for the New York area, including Brooklyn. And I said to myself, great, Marshall was a hero of mine. I've been in the civil rights movement. I said, Marshall will surely understand the human rights of people in Cambodia who are being bombed with use of unconstitutional powers by the United States president. Well, Marshall refused to stay the appellate court decision. Under Supreme Court rules, we were allowed at that time to go and find some other judge who, if another judge would give us an opinion. And so we went to Justice Douglas. He was then in Goose Prairie, Washington, because this was August and the court was in recess. And the ACLU lawyers went out there, and Justice Douglas scheduled an immediate hearing in the courthouse near Goose Prairie, Washington. And Justice Douglas issued an injunction, again, to stop the war from the bombing of Cambodia. And what did Justice Douglas say? He said, this is like a capital case. He said, there could be irreparable injury. People will die. If the bombing continues, it could be pilots who will die. It will be Cambodians who will die. We need to have a full hearing on this issue. And what happened then? Under the Supreme Court rules, once a judge has issued a stay, it can only be undone by a majority of court sitting. You need a quorum, sitting as a majority. But they didn't have a majority of the court or a quorum of the court because this one was in Africa and that one was in Europe and that one was in South America. None of them, there was no quorum in Washington, D.C. So what do you think they did? This was a situation where a Supreme Court justice had affirmed the lower federal court justice and said, we're issuing a stay of the bombing. This was inconceivable, unacceptable, and impermissible. So what happened was the Justice Department went back to Justice Marshall and got him to, quote unquote, overrule Justice Douglas in violation, in my opinion, and in the opinion of Justice Douglas, of the rules of the Supreme Court. Marshall said, I've called all my colleagues on the court, one by one. They didn't have conference call, one by one, and they all agreed with me. As Douglas said, the way we make decisions is not one by one. We have a conference. Everybody gets to talk. You get to challenge each other's points of view. That's the whole point of a court sitting together. Anyway, the court violated its own rules, in my opinion, to keep the bombing of Cambodia going. It just shows you where our institutions of government were. You had the President of the United States who wanted to keep the bombing going and the war going. You had the Congress trying to stop it, but you had the courts complicit with the President because the courts did not have the guts to stand up for what was constitutionally right and permissible. I think it's important to understand that for what the future holds. This is like a three-legged stool. And if the courts are not going to play their role, you've got a very wobbly situation. And a situation in which the public has to play a bigger role and the Congress has to play a bigger role, and that's not always possible. The other thing, that way in which the war undermined U.S. democracy, was that there were illegal efforts taken against anti-war protesters. As we now know, and it was fully documented in congressional hearings afterwards, The FBI engaged in illegal surveillance. The CIA engaged in illegal surveillance. The military engaged in illegal surveillance. These institutions of government were willing to break U.S. laws to keep the war going. This is a situation in which the rule of law did not apply, and institutions of government were above the law. And of course, the other fact that we need to think about, which was a critical fact, was the resistance to the war, the public resistance, the popular resistance to the war. Students all over the country, we know about that. The Vietnam veterans who dumped 1,000 medals on the Capitol steps woke up the American people to the idea that veterans themselves are against the war. Obviously not all of them, but even a substantial number was an amazing phenomenon. The public protest in the end is what stopped the war. And I want to give you a story about that to give you an idea of, you may say, well, how does a public protest affect members of Congress? How can they stop the war? Well, when I got to Congress I was elected in 1972, and at the end of 72 or at the beginning of 73, we had a Democratic caucus. The Republicans have their caucus, and we have our caucus. And people, it's a private session, and people get up and talk about what the policy should be of the particular party vis-a-vis Congress. And I will never forget, I mean, I replaced a staunch supporter of the war, and there were others elected with me at that time who replaced staunch supporters of the war. But one of the people who got up to speak was a member of Congress from Georgia, an old-timer. He'd probably been there 30 or 40 years. And he got up and he said, and tears were streaming down his cheeks, and he got up and said, I have always supported my president on war making, on national security. But my people, my constituents are against this war, and I have to vote against it. He said that, and I will never forget it. And it was really a crisis of conscience for him, but in the end, the democracy worked for him because people in his own district were able to persuade somebody who had never said no to a president, who had never said no to a military activity, to do that. So in sum, there were many bad things about the Vietnam War, not only the war itself and the brutal conduct of the war, the assault on democracy, the failure of the courts, and the failure for many years of the Congress to act on presidential war making. But the other very important problem with regard to the conduct of the war was no accountability for government wrongdoing, no investigation, no holding anyone responsible, and no one took responsibility for the damage to Vietnam. Of course, on the other side of the ledger, the good side of the ledger, the American people stood up to injustice, to an unjust war. Laws on surveillance were reformed. There was exposure of what happened. We created a FISA court. There were limits on the term of the FBI director because people saw how much power Hoover had obtained. Congress enacted the War Powers Resolution, direct result of the Vietnam War. President couldn't do any secret bombing anymore because the president under the War Powers Resolution had to report any military activities. And there was an automatic provision for an automatic withdrawal of U.S. forces if Congress didn't approve within 60 days. So you couldn't have the situation that we had where the war was continued because the president wanted to keep it going. Congress stopped the bombing, and with regard to President Nixon, the House Judiciary Committee voted unanimously to impeach him, but there was a resolution for impeachment that dealt with the secret bombing of Cambodia and the assault on Congress's right to know and the Constitution, and the committee rejected that resolution of impeachment. It's important to bear that in mind because even in the end, Congress itself did not want to hold President Nixon or any president responsible for misuse of war-making powers, even when doing so, assaulted directly Congress's prerogatives under the Constitution. I think the important thing is to look at where this leaves us. What has been the legacy of Vietnam? Have we learned our lessons from Vietnam? My answer is a few lessons we've learned. I've just mentioned a few, but some we have not. The deceptions on war making continue, clearly. All we have to do is look at the Iraq War and the deceptions that took place with regard to that. We were driven into the Iraq War by deliberate deceptions by the president and his top staff. And that, by the way, in terms of accountability, is similar to the Vietnam War. There's been a total refusal to hold anyone accountable, not only to hold anyone accountable, but even to know the facts. There has been no investigation by the United States of the decision to go to war in Iraq. By the way, Little Netherlands had a big inquiry. They appointed the former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to take a look at how it happened that Netherlands went to war. And they found, by the way, lying by the Prime Minister to the Parliament, some of the same things that happened here, but they exposed it. We have done nothing. Okay, we still have presidential overreaching with regard to war-making powers. We've been told President Obama bombed Libya with, in my opinion, disastrous results. And he said, well, war powers resolution doesn't apply. Bombing, that's not war-making. I can bomb, and I can do it by myself. That is certainly a situation in which two heads would have been better than one in terms of possibly saying, well, have you thought about what's going to happen after you bomb? I mean, I think President Obama said one of my mistakes was not to realize what was going to happen afterwards. Okay. We have continued use of chemical weapons in our military actions. All we have to do is think about the use of depleted uranium in the Gulf, some of the Gulf wars. We're using some of the same strategies that we used in Vietnam. We never learned the lesson. Vietnamization did not work. It was a political strategy to extricate U.S. troops that Nixon determined he wanted to use. We were going to turn over the war to Vietnam. We were going to train all of the Vietnamese troops, and they were going to win the war. Guess what? They didn't, and it was a useless effort. Well, what have we done in Afghanistan? We have trained and trained and trained and trained, and I can't say trained enough times, to the tune of billions. And what has that done? We can't even remove all of our troops because we know the minute they're gone, just as what happened in Vietnam, that'll be overrun. But we never learned the lesson. Same thing has happened in Iraq. With all the training that took place, we had to come in and bomb in order for ISIS to stop ISIS. Congress, what kind of check is it? In a way, it's been weaker than ever. Failure to hold President Bush accountable for the deceptions, failure to hold anyone accountable for torture, failure to, and even right now, shielding the whole story about torture. Okay. The reliance on bombing as a military tool. Just think about Cambodia. I've been mentioning bombing of Cambodia. Some historians have argued that it was the bombing of Cambodia that enabled the Khmer Rouge to come to power in Cambodia, a terrible and disastrous result, leading to genocide of 1 million, maybe more than 1 million people. What do we do with bombing? We bombed Libya. What happened? Destabilization of Libya and chaos in Libya. What's happening in Pakistan with the use of drones? Destabilization of that part of the world. Somehow we have not understood that the lessons of what we've done in the past. We are not learning from the past, or we refuse to see the reality of what happened in the past. I also want to say that surveillance, which was uncovered and fought during the Vietnam War, now surveillance is total of all Americans, and it's lawful. Or at least, and by the way, the courts refuse to allow challenges so that we can't even attack this. So here's the other part of this story, is that the courts have refused, as they did with regard to the Vietnam War, to allow challenges to take place to national security policy. Mr. Snowden is in exile, just like the draft resistors during Vietnam. Another reminder of the past. And our military budget is astronomical. It's at least 7 times as big as the military budgets of the 7 countries that are next to us, next in line to us. And by the way, have we learned something about, is there a Vietnam syndrome? Have we learned about hesitating before we go to war? I believe that military solutions are still the default mode. For example, I give President Obama great credit for trying to resolve the standoff with Iran over nuclear weapons through diplomatic means. But just yesterday, he agreed with Japan, basically to form some kind of a military alliance that undermines the Japanese Constitution itself against any offensive use of military. After World War II, Japan adopted a constitution that prohibited militarization of Japan except for self-defense purposes. And here we are, so many years later, trying to undo that provision. For what purpose? So, to me, I'm not sure how much we've learned. Have we learned a lot? We've learned some, but some of the basic lessons have not been learned. And I meant to mention also, by the way, in terms of executive military power, the President of the United States now claims that he has the power to use drones against foreigners, against American citizens, to assassinate them abroad. When it will be in the United States will be another question, but this is the beginning of a very slippery slope. So what kind of country does this leave us with? We're not too far from a city close by called Baltimore. Flames went up there just a few days ago. In Baltimore, if you look at the areas in which riots were taking place, the health conditions of the people mirror third world countries. You look at the poverty rate, it's awful. You look at the unemployment rate, it's 3 times, 37% unemployment for young black men between the ages of 24 and 37, 10% for white men at that age level. If you want to look at statistics about the United States, people can call us an exceptional country, except we're not exceptional in the quality of life we're now affording our citizens. Whether it's in health care and life expectancy, whether it's in schooling, whether it's in education, whether it's in housing. We have an infrastructure that's aging and antiquated. We could put people to work, we're not. So the question is, what are we going to do about these lessons of Vietnam? How much militarism are we going to have? How much war making are we going to have? And deplete our own resources and fail to address the issues of justice in our own country? I think it's about time for us to learn the lessons of Vietnam. And in the end, it can only happen through people. When I saw Representative Flint change his mind, crying on the floor of the House of Representatives, I know that people can make a difference. It's just that too many of us say, we can't do anything about it. It's impossible. You can't fight City Hall. You can't fight Washington. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's necessary. And if we did it once, we can do it again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. That was very powerful and sobering, but hopeful at the end, I think. We don't have much time for discussion. I did want to ask a couple of participants to offer some comments, maybe some initial response. And I had asked Peter Weiss and perhaps Charlie Clements if they can bring the microphones down, or our students, Peter, have the microphone so they can bring it.
I just want to thank Elizabeth for everything she's done.
Thank
And
you.
boy, do we need you in the Congress.
No, we got plenty of good people there still. Thank you.
And I'm glad that, is this on?
No,
Yes?
no.
It's on now, right?
Yeah, much better. Very good.
And thank you very much for bringing in the law, because while David Courtwright has done a superb job in organizing this academic conference, you should have had a different name for the first panel. Instead of was the war just, it should have been was the war legal? Because you can have, in terms of David Little's definition, you could have a just war that is not legal. And we desperately need to bring the law back into this question of how you decide whether a war is legal under national and international law. And I want to say a couple of things about the most dangerous word, double word, in the English language: self-defense. The Charter of the United Nations makes it perfectly clear that the only two circumstances in which a war is permissible are a Security Council resolution, which you're never going to get with this Security Council, or self-defense. And self-defense has now gotten to the point where that great international lawyer, Dick Cheney, said 2% of the possibility of a country harming us would be enough for us to attack that country. That's what self-defense means these days. And it's the same thing with Ferguson and Baltimore and Staten Island. Self-defense, right? I saw the guy reaching for something in his pocket, and I thought it was a gun, so I killed him. It's the same thing at the world stage. So I want to just take a minute to tell you about the Caroline affair. Now, you may think that that was a sex scandal, but it wasn't. It was a very important incident in American history in 1840, when the British troops in Canada, where there was a rebellion going on, and the Brits suspected that the United States was backing the rebellion, they attacked under the cover of night a brig called the Caroline and set it on fire and let it float down over Niagara Falls. And Daniel Webster, then the Secretary of State, negotiated a treaty with his counterpart, Baron Ashburton, in the UK, which established the only legitimate the only legitimate definition of self-defense, which has been part of international law ever since 1842. And it says self-defense is justified only in a situation where you have instant, overwhelming circumstances, leaving no opportunity for consideration. In other words, it's got to have bang, bang, right now. It can't be anticipatory, which it has been in Afghanistan and Iraq, and it can't be looking forwards, saying this country may do something to us at some time in the future. So my question is really a follow-up on the question you asked yourself, Liz. What can we do to bring the notion of self-defense back to what it ought to be? Because right now it doesn't make it possible to follow the Charter of the United Nations, which prohibits aggression except in case of self-defense. What can we do to make self-defense a criterion that would make it possible to have a world existing under the rule of law?
Well, it's a very important question, and I can just give you one small answer to it, which is that in some way the American people understand the issue of self-defense. And that's why the Bush administration, Cheney and President Bush and the team of his top officials had to orchestrate lying about the war because they had to create the impression that we were in danger. For example, Condoleezza Rice gets on TV and she says, mushroom cloud. Everybody understands what that means. Well, Saddam Hussein was working, they said, on nuclear weapons, and there was going to be a mushroom cloud. We could not let that happen. We could not let the United States be attacked by a mushroom cloud. There was nobody in America who disagreed with that. Then and to build that, to make that argument stronger, they came up with this phony argument about the yellow cake uranium, which was, they claimed that Iraq was trying to buy the yellow cake uranium from the country of Niger. Then they came up with this argument about the aluminum tubes, where they were able to manipulate a New York Times reporter to report about aluminum tubes that could, quote unquote, only be used for nuclear weapons. But of course, the actual reports of the CIA and other agencies, not the CIA, but the other agencies, the Nuclear Energy Agency, said that these are not for nuclear weapons. So the Bush administration took advantage of what American people understand. Yes, we have a right to protect ourselves against an imminent attack. I think there's no question about that. That people viscerally understood it. And what Bush and Cheney did was that they took advantage of the American people's concern for their own safety and the safety of their families and the safety of their country by building up this false and deceptive picture that we were going to be attacked by Saddam Hussein and he had nuclear weapons and we would have a mushroom cloud over America. Nobody has paid one penny of a price for the lies to the American people. So I'm not sure that we need to explain that, because I think American people understand that viscerally. What we have to do is somehow stop American officials from lying to the American people and preying on their concern about their own safety. And that's what happened in Iraq. Of course, they did a few other things, a few other lies, such as Saddam Hussein and bin Laden were in cahoots. That was the other big lie that they told. But of course, people who knew something about history knew that that was a lie, but how many people knew about the difference between Shiites and Sunnis and history and where bin Laden was and where Saddam Hussein was on these issues? So that's part of the problem. I'm not so sure that it's necessarily having to inculcate that we have a right to act only in self-defense. I think the real problem is that the government has been willing to lie to the American people, to prey on this idea and to distort the idea. And if we could somehow, if we held officials accountable, perhaps this wouldn't happen in the future. But nobody's investigated the lies of the Bush administration. And nobody's held any of them responsible.
Charlie.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for what you've done with your life and
Introduce
for
yourself, Charlie.
your comments today. My name is Charlie Clements. I'm with the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. In the beginning of the conference, David mentioned that the Vietnam War was a dark and unknown chapter in American history. I want to expand upon that with regard to Cambodia specifically, and then I'll follow with a question. In January 1970, I was a C-130 pilot. My crew was selected to fly a top-secret mission into Phnom Penh. We were told it was a diplomatic mission, and there was a State Department team that we were escorting there. We went to a certain rendezvous point. We met with some old MiG-17s that could fly about the speed that we did, and then escorted down to the runway. We waited 8 or 10 hours on the tarmac for this team to complete their business, and they came back, and we flew back to Tan Son Nhut and Saigon. A couple of days later, in a bar, I was with someone in the OSI, the Office of Special Investigation of the Air Force. They were the only ones allowed to wear civilian clothes in Saigon. And one of his buddies who was with the CIA, and we were talking about what we've been doing, and I, as a young man, boasted about my mission, and the CIA guy said, you know, you're an idiot, Clements, if you think that's what's happening. I had a team on your flight, and in 6 weeks you'll see a man named Law Nol topple Sihanouk when he goes to Paris for medical leave, and 6 weeks after that we'll be invited to invade Cambodia. I thought he was just trying to rain on my parade. 6 weeks later, Sihanouk is in Paris. Law Nol says, I'm in charge. 6 weeks after that, I'm flying 8 missions to the Parrot's Beak, taking a fully loaded C-130 with 80 combat-ready troops there. And at the end of the day, I decided I wouldn't fly any more missions in Southeast Asia. You know, that's a dark fact, and the truth of that has never emerged. I hope it will someday, but I think that we engineered the invasion and the coup in Cambodia. In 2000,
Am I supposed to be surprised by that?
I was at the time, but that's how I was naive. Fast forward to 2000, the first president to visit Vietnam in 25 years, Bill Clinton, is going there. Part of his mission is to find MIA POWs. Part of it is humanitarian, to map out where unexploded ordnance is that has plagued South Asia. And he released an amazing database that the Rand Corporation and IBM had come up with that cataloged all the bombing missions from 1965 till 1975. Which planes were flown, where they were flown, and what the ordnance was that was dropped. Examination of that database revealed that the bombing in Cambodia had started under President Johnson in 1965, and by December of 1970, that is 6 months after the incursion into Cambodia, we had dropped 500,000 tons of bombs in Cambodia. But by the time 1975 rolled around, we had dropped 2,750,000 tons of bombs in Cambodia, making it the most heavily bombed country in the history of the world. That tonnage was 5 to 6 times what we had known before that database was released by President Clinton. It also calls into question the casualties of 150 to 200,000 Cambodians killed because the tonnage was at least 5 or 6 times that. So it seems like to me that that's a war crime that has remained really uninvestigated. So my question to you is, holding people accountable at this stage, of course, is virtually impossible, but in other countries such as Guatemala and Chile and Argentina and South Africa, we've seen truth commissions, that if you can't get justice, you can at least get at the truth. And what do you think the chances are that we could have that kind of affair?
Well, I guess I'm a cockeyed optimist. I don't say never to that. I think there could be a truth commission. I do think that particularly if you linked all the wars together, Iraq, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, to find out all that we did. Maybe something could happen. But I do not believe in stopping with truth commissions. Maybe it's because I was a prosecutor. And maybe also because I tried to bring Nazi war criminals to justice and did succeed. You know, President Bush, the lies are US crimes. Torture is a US crime. Pinochet took 25 years, maybe even longer, to bring Pinochet to justice. And they were in the process of doing that when he finally died. One of the interesting things about, and I've written about this in one of my books, is that there's one good thing in the Patriot Act. And that is, it removes the statute of limitations on torture when you use torture to create a risk of serious bodily harm or death. I mean, there was no statute of limitations on torture that causes death. Waterboarding creates a risk of death, and that's not what I say. The CIA's own Office of Medical Services has said that it creates a risk of hypothermia and drowning. And so the people who were responsible for torture could be prosecuted for as long as they live. Will it ever happen? I cannot say no, it'll never happen, because someday there may be somebody, and maybe the country will realize what was done in our name. I don't know that you can have prosecution for what happened in Cambodia or in, we don't have the same, I don't know what the facts are. I don't know that any president sat around and ordered torture as President Bush did, and his cohorts were sitting around in the White House actually determining how much more waterboarding should take place. Well, we don't have that evidence. If that evidence exists, well, I don't know. The statute of limitations may have run out on those crimes. I don't know. But I do think that there is something to be said in terms of accountability for telling the truth. And that alone, because of the shame it brings on people, could be an important deterrent. And the sad thing to me is that we seem to have two standards of justice now in America. We have a standard of impunity for the very powerful, the rich, the banksters, the generals, and so forth. They get, if they ever get a sentence, it's very light. And then everybody else has a normal standard of justice. These things have to change.
Okay, please join me in thanking Elizabeth Holtzman.
Thank you.
There's many good questions I know we have, but we have a nice reception upstairs for everyone, so let's continue the questions and discussion. And we have the next 2 days of further opportunities to hear from panelists.